Hey everybody, Steve Garris with the show 713. Super excited for our next guest today, Houston photographer and Houston historian, Story Sloane. Story's going to be talking with us about 100 years of photography that him and his dad have captured over the years in the Houston photography landscape. And each of those images that he and his dad have captured, of course, with a name like Story, you know there's got to be a story that goes with those photos. So he's going to be sharing a lot of those stories around some of the specific images that to him really resonate and capture the character of Houston. So go ahead and, if you would, subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you like what you're hearing on this one, go ahead and please hit the like button. So let's get right into it. Here's Story Sloane. So welcome, Story, to the show 713 podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic.
Did you have any trouble finding it?
I absolutely did not. Being a native Houstonian, I know where to turn and where to go and what type of traffic to try to avoid.
This is true. So for the first time, we are broadcasting from the new Houston Ion Technology Incubator Mecca. Formerly, it was what building?
The old Sears and Roebuck building.
There you go. So yeah, I did visit it right before it got closed down. It is probably ready for it to. It was time.
Well, you know, it's amazing that the Sears moved to this location. It was originally over there off of Buffalo Drive near Buffalo Bayou. And in the 1935 flood, it flooded out. So there was a lot of discussion about building a retail business adjacent to a bayou, especially in Houston, Texas. The last big flood was in 29, but this one was pretty bad. So they ended up relocating to this location, which I'm glad they kept the structure.
Yeah, I kind of watched it being built, and they took it down to the frame, bare bones, and then from there, I think they added one or two more stories on. Well,
they stripped it down and dressed it up.
Yes.
And from what I can tell, and I walked around and shot some photographs of it, it's just wonderful. The last photographs I have of this building were taken by my father back in the mid-40s.
Oh, wow.
So from in front of the Delman Theater, which used to be across the street, which is no more.
Okay, so your father was also an historian or a photographer?
My father was an amateur photographer, and he grew in to be a professional photographer for Shell Oil, a photographer during the Korean War in the Air Force. So his passion for photography flowed over to me as a young man. And I eventually acquired professional equipment and followed his footsteps. My father, however, could not raise a family of 5 on a photographer's salary, so he got into the oil business, thank the Lord. Oh, and I followed his passion as a commercial photographer.
What was he? Was he a photographer on the oil rigs, or was he actually working like a?
Well, he was a petroleum landman, so he would go out and lease a property before they would drill the oil well. However, he would take his camera with him and go out there and photograph the derricks and all the action and the roughnecks. And he took me as a young man out there, well, actually as a young boy, to visit those oil wells, which is part of our Texas heritage.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, you must have been just amazed. I mean, just the size and
I was terrified. I was terrified because of the sound, the noise, the vibration. You'd walk up on the derrick floor, and of course, they wouldn't want a young man up there. The foreman or the drill pushers, they didn't like that. But my father was a company man, so they allowed it. But I had to be on my best behavior. And he showed me the floor and where they did the actual drilling. And then I was escorted to the bottom of the stairs where he finished conducting his business with the engineers on site.
Okay. Yeah, I've had the privilege as well to film a little bit on some of the land rigs.
Right.
Never out on the offshore. But yeah, I remember... like you said, the noise, that's one thing, and the vibrations. And then somebody said, hey, if you see, if you've got water around your ankles or mud, they call it, please run.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, that's enough for me to,
Well, I became an oil field photographer when I first got out of college, and I went out and shot oil derricks for several different oil companies. And, of course, the big thing there was not falling down into the mud pit, which is the drilling mud, and once you get in there, you're in serious trouble. And one time I did start sliding down the side, and I just brought a brand new Hasselblad camera, so it was very expensive. So I was holding the camera up high with one hand while I was trying to capture my balance. And I could could hear the crew on the derrick floor above all of that noise laughing. And because I was covered in mud, and they weren't going to let me get into serious trouble.
Right.
But I stopped about 1.5 feet from being in big trouble.
Oh, my.
But I preserved my camera. So I did have to change my clothes. But anyway, it was one of those memorable occasions that you just never forget. Yeah. But I think it solidified my passion of getting out in the field and photographing and capturing whatever the subject matter was.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So you're out there on the rigs as the photographer. What are you looking for?
I'm looking for design elements. I'm looking for angles. Of course, every annual report wanted a sunrise, sunset picture that showed the rig in the back.
Sure.
If they thought it was going to be a productive well, which was back then was in the neighborhood of $50, $60, $70 million, wow. I was pretty sure I was going to get the cover of the annual report, which meant I would get a little bit more work down the line, the more covers that you had.
That's like the Rolling Stone of the oil industry. Yeah.
It is. And, when I transitioned from the oil field to Houston and the architecture, then that's when I started noticing, well, I'm shooting this building, mid-rise building that's going up, but I remember the building that was there before this building.
Oh, wow.
That they tore down in like 3 or 4 days or over the weekend in order to start this construction. So I started noticing landmarks of Houston disappear, one after another. And that's just by driving around the city when I first graduated back in '81.
And what was it that you were noticing? That it was the architecture? Was it the lack of, people aren't going to gather there anymore? Or?
It was more the absence of the architecture. And when I was about 11 or 12, I grew up on the west side of town over in Memorial. And my father was out of town an awful lot, but when he would come back into town, he'd go downtown and type up his leases. And he would take me and my brother with him. And he said, I don't want you becoming a mall rat. I want you to know downtown. He'd give us $10 a piece, a bunch of loose bills and a bunch of quarters. We knew where he worked and his phone number, and he turned us loose. Now, I don't think you'd do that these days, but we went. And the first thing my older brother would do would be ditch me. And so I would have to go explore on my own. So even as a youth, I would realize that, wow, these buildings that were really neat and iconic, as I grew older, I started realizing they're not there anymore. Mm-hmm. Because I love downtown. I like going down and taking photographs. I like going down, listening to the music, the restaurants, especially fresh out of college. So it was a pleasant experience. However, I would notice, wow, this is the old William Penn Hotel, and that's not there anymore. And, one by one, they started being imploded. And of course, the mentality of most Houston forefathers, I believe, was build something, tear it down, build something better. It wasn't a lack of historical preservation. It was a fact of growth. Right. We're going to make our city a major metropolis. And if it takes ripping down all this whole block, then we're going to do it because we're going to make it better. But I think in I would say the 60s and 70s and 80s, there came a point to where we need to preserve a part of our built environment and the history of the individuals who took the risk to build those buildings. We need to preserve that to some degree. My father acquired a archive of a commercial photographer that was primarily active in the 20s and the 1930s. Oh, nice. And that was a boom decade, the 1920s, for the city of Houston. The Gulf building was going up. The third wing of the Rice Hotel was going up. The Esperson building, that are still standing today, were going up. Those were, I think, reasons for me, and all these images were contained in this archive that got me interested in coming down to say, okay, how many of these buildings are still there?
And now hopefully more kind of staying around. It seems like there's kind of a move like this building, even though it's not the Sears building, they did keep the frame and kind
of.
And then I guess there's the new Post building down by, I think it's the 713. There's like a concert hall and that kind of thing. Is that enough to preserve? I mean, I know it's not fully dipping your both feet back in the past. But I
think anything that we can preserve that's going to be a link to our community's past and history is worthwhile. The post office downtown, which I used to go to and mail my taxes. Of course, burning the midnight oil, they go down there and they have people standing outside and they would take them. And now what I understand is that they've renovated it into a beautiful space. It has rooftop gardens. It is absolutely, from the photographs I've seen, a wonderful, wonderful transformation. So we can't save everything, but I think what we do save, we need to be cognizant of the history of that. Mm-hmm. And probably the best example is the 1910 Harris County Courthouse, and a project that started out well over a decade ago. And I participated with on a small scale by providing them images of the courthouse back in the 20s. It wasn't that old then. It was maybe 10 years old, 13, 14 years old. And so the architects could look at this high quality, high scan imagery and maybe decide, well, this is how the window treatment should be, because it has to be all restored authentically. So that was a fun project. And then I printed a photograph up of the courthouse and made some posters. And we handed out 1,000 posters during that dedication.
Oh, beautiful.
So now that was not totally altruistic, because I knew there'd be 1,000 lawyers there who might need artwork for their offices.
Yes.
So, but it was a joy, because everybody thoroughly enjoyed seeing. And the photograph was not necessarily of the courthouse building itself, but it was of a bunch of whiskey stills that were confiscated in 1928 in January because the Democratic Convention was held in 1928 that summer.
Oh, nice.
And they didn't want all the delegates to go around and get drunk, because that's one thing we had a proliferation of here in Houston was speakeasies and alcohol.
Oh, sure.
So these whiskey stills were piled high. A couple of district attorneys were standing in front of them looking very stern. And I thought, well, this makes a better image than the courthouse as a whole, because it's in front of the courthouse. And there was a horse trough there, because in the 20s, 1928, people were still coming in, truck farmers were coming in, and you had to have a place to water your horse. So there was a sign in front of it that said $5 fine for blocking the horse trough. And $5 was a week's salary back then.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of money. Yeah.
So they were serious. So, working on projects like that sort of get me drawn a little bit deeper into photography and the history of Houston. My father, of course, paid for my education, and he paid handsomely for it. So when I graduated, he volunteered me for every organization and board that he was on to get a little payback. And I, as a photographer, would go shoot PR events.
Wonderful.
One of these organizations was the Harris County Heritage Society. And so I would go shoot their candlelight tours and the 4th of July celebrations. And when the Texas Army was there, I'd photograph that. And by doing that, I'm drawn a little bit deeper into the history, the fascinating history of our city.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that, I don't know if your dad back in the 20s, do you have that mindset as you're taking a photo today? People 100 years, in the future are going to be looking at it and maybe needing it to, renovate a building?
Well, when I do this, I do it mainly for personal edification, for personal gratification of capturing a scene. And I am cognizant of the fact that down the line, this may be used as a point of reference. So having an archive that contains some very rare imagery, because this archive is around 3,000 images, and it's from a collection where they burned over 25, close to 30,000 images. So my father was only able to save about 10%. So there's not a lot of crossover, cross-section between other commercial photographers during that period of time because they didn't share common clients.
Right.
So the rarity of these images mandates when I come downtown and with my camera, I'm looking for what was contained in that archive and what I could do for better or worse, a before and after type of image from it. And realizing that my after image may be the interim image to some photographer in the future, saying, wow, okay, now we've got an 80-year span right here. We're going to do another 80-year span with, I remember that old photographer, Sloane, and his stuff. And it's digital, and it hadn't got near a magnet. It survived, so it's something that I ponder about, but I try to stay rooted in the current.
Yeah, for sure. So since you have the span from 1920 to now, you have that visual, obviously hearts long for 100 years ago. But as a photographer, as a historian, architecturally, where are we today in relation to, and again, I understand the nostalgia of the old photo. Do you like buildings today, or do you just prefer the ones from the historian?
Oh, I love the modern architecture. I mean, that's my favorite thing to shoot when I go down to Houston. I like, again, I'm more drawn towards design elements, diagonal lines, very graphic imagery. And if you look at the steel and glass skin buildings downtown and the reflections, it's just incredible. Reflection upon reflection upon reflection. And the trick for me is to get in the right location in the right spot to make a pleasing composition with that. And it's almost to the abstract, where somebody first looks at it, they go, oh, I don't know what building that is. But and then I said, oh, well, you know, that's the old TCB Bank building, and or this is the Chase building. And or I will contrast them with images of the Esperson building, which is the old, that have a backdrop, which used to be one of the tallest, like the Gulf building used to be one of the tallest in Houston, and they're now totally surrounded by these mammoth skyscrapers. And to me, that the showcasing of the old and the new is what makes it fascinating, and again draws a link to the history of our community, to where we can say, well, we haven't torn that one down yet, and praise the Lord, hopefully we never will, and we'll keep it as an example of the growth of our city.
Yeah, Houston has definitely had such a crazy 100 years, and
it is. And there's a lot of people that I think are really get upset about not preserving the past. And it's always been my family's objective with this archive to project the positive aspects of the past. And if they can't save a particular building, I feel it's counterproductive to be too, I'm not going to say whining or complaining about it. It's better to showcase what we have saved and preserved as examples to the next generation, to say, hey, look, let's not tear this down, because in a lot of instances it comes up to the decision of one individual. And the fact that Houston lacks a proper museum for its history and culture is a big problem, because there's no place really where we can go and see it all. Mm-hmm. This is Houston, and this is going to show every aspect of Houston's history, but also we're going to add the culture of Houston in with it and show the history of the different, whether they're ethnic or religious cultures of our community that we live in. So everybody can learn in one place and then appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's a majority of what I hear you saying is it's the appreciation, the stop on the, stop on a corner of a street in Houston and just do a 360.
Well, and I've said this many times, that the soul of any community lies within the history of that community. And once you dig deep and find the history of that, especially the positive aspects of it, because there's a lot of people out there who like harping on the negative aspects, but you find the positive aspects of it, then you can say, well, the first black firefighters were slaves. When the white firefighters were out fighting the Civil War, the black slaves were keeping the city from burning down. And it would take almost 100 years for the first black firefighter to be hired by the city of Houston. And the only reason then was because they opened up a fire station in a black neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
So, but that's a long period of time, but that's progress. And that shows that progress can come slowly, but every aspect, every person in our community has something positive that they can put on the table and show and say, hey, look, I was serving the community even before I was a free man. So to me, I think that's very strong and it's very powerful.
It is very palpable, yeah, for sure.
Well, they used to, the developers back in the day, and people have to realize that the developers, pretty much real estate controls the flow of the city's power. I don't believe it's oil. I don't believe it's a medical industry. I think it's the real estate concern. So they determine which district is going to be historic, what can be preserved and what should not be preserved. And that can be a conflict. Over the years, it's proven to be a conflict. But I think there's an awakening of individuals who are noticing, because the Astrodome is a classic example. You know, what Ed Emmett did and keeping that from the wrecking block. You know, bear in mind that it probably would cost $35 to $40 million to tear it down. So who wants to spend that in a down economy to tear something
Right.
down when we can spend $100 million to $150 to preserve it? And then maybe generate some revenue once again from it. But it's a one of a kind. It is, and it's something that I think a lot of people can get behind. Most of the common complaints against it are, tax dollars, which I looked it up one year, and when they were really talking heavy about tearing it down, and to preserve it would be like $9 out of everyone's pocket who earned over $250,000 a year. And that's one beer, maybe two, at one of our sports venues.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
The tax issue is not it. They can spend $110 million on dog parks, but, not to preserve the eighth wonder of the world. And an iconic example of Houston's greatness and what we could accomplish, what Hawthorne's could accomplish, the first baseball indoors and air conditioned to boot.
Yeah, that we had Mike Acosta on here, and he's definitely a big fan of keeping it. And are there any plans that you've seen that tickle you to be like, ooh, that might be good for it, or you think it's enough just to have it stand there?
I think if they stripped it down and made an indoor park out of it, there's been talks about stripping it down and making a sports venue out of it, where college and high schools could have track and field events there. Of course, my idea was make the colossal museum of Houston's history and culture out of it.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah,
And
that makes sense.
you could level it up to every floor and have a different decade for every floor, from 1836 when the city was first founded all the way up. And but incredibly expensive. Museums, $80, $100 million and up, and it's just a lot of people have pushback. However, there's enough rich individuals in the city of Houston that they could afford that. Houston has billions and billions of dollars that is available, and it's not that individual priority. So I think the more publicity, the more PR that's giving to Houston's history, maybe one of these individuals will go, well, that's not a bad idea. And maybe my legacy, instead of building this wing to this hospital, would be putting it in, the seed money, in for this museum. So not only would it be a tourist attraction, but it would be a place for natives, people who moved to Houston, whether they've been here, their family's been here 200 years or 2 days,
right,
and say, let's go check this place out, because now we're going to learn about our community and the people who came here.
Yeah, it is amazing. The Astrodome was such an anomaly of greatness, it seems like, in the city's, certainly the architecture, but just again, the, building of it. Like, why is that not necessarily, at least in my eyes, and maybe you can label some other places that are as iconic as something like that being built? I mean, the architecture wonder of the ability for it, the dollars, and like you said, first indoor. I mean, there's just so many
it's hard to compare Houston to any other city or any other place, because I have not, in my studies of history, I have not really found any other city in the United States that has had such a rapid growth as Houston. I mean, we're 650 plus square miles these days. That's huge. I mean, that is really, really large. I mean, we're one of the busiest ports. The medical center is huge. All of these industry that came here, and it all started with timber. Mm-hmm. They could cut timber and drill a water well up in East Texas and hit oil and go, well, darn, we wanted water. And now we have this oil because there wasn't any production use for it. But then that changed. So I think Houston is not an anomaly, but Houston is a community that is unlike any other place. And I think that's why it's so special. And I think that's another reason where people need to know, wow, this individual came here. Ross Sterling, governor of Texas and founder of Humble Oil, which became Exxon, was one of the founders. His life story, starting out under meager means and then rising to such greatness. Well, Houston was a place where millionaires were hard fought and earned, but they had the incentive and they had the gumption to come here and do it. So, and I don't see that in Chicago, and I really don't see that in New York, and I don't see it in Los Angeles. I mean, all of those communities had their own set of individuals, but not to the degree that our city, Houston, has exhibited. And people need to know about that.
I agree. And I think it is, I think people are starting to flex a little bit more of their gumption, at least a little bit.
I think so. I mean, given what's happened over the past, the past 2 years with the pandemic, and you throw in Harvey and a freeze and a potential war that's looming in Europe, which we could easily get drawn into. All of that is I think an anxiety that people are feeling that I think can be eased somewhat by learning a little bit more about their local community, their neighbors. And, because it used to be block parties here in town, and then it became a neighbor's night out once a year. And then it became, well, I want to build a higher fence so I don't have to deal with my neighbors. I want to go home. I want to have a cocktail. I want to have dinner and forget about all this stress. Well, unfortunately, that's the world that we live in today. But when I want to get an escape, I'm not necessarily going to play a video game or binge on Game of Thrones. I'm going to do a little historic reference, history search.
Nice.
And start trying to discover something that nobody else knows, or if they do know it, they don't know as much about it as some of the images in my archive that they contain.
Yeah, that is great. So some of these buildings, are there maybe some secrets within the buildings, some trapdoors?
Well, I think there's rumors, of course, that, that the library downtown, the old Edison Library, is haunted.
Oh.
And I think that's kind of a fabrication, more so just as to generate a point of interest.
For the duck tours?
Yeah. And, the Lamar Hotel, the Lamar Hotel was on the corner of Lamar and Main Street on the, was the northwest corner. And there was a room, and I feel terrible, I can't remember the exact room number, but it was where the power players of Texas met.
Oh, wow.
And the people who made all the decisions about what was what in Houston, they met. So there's places that people are just going to have to go and discover. There's walking tours that are pretty good. You can go downtown and get a little history. With COVID, I've been off the lecture circuit. So normally I would go out and I'd lecture to anybody. It can be a group of 15, 20 people at a lunch group in somebody's home, or I'll go to an auditorium and I'll lecture. So, and it could be 100, 150 people about our city's community, history, the history of Houston, also the history of photography, which, photography was a great invention. The French invented it, and they gave it to the world free. So they bought the patent up and said, we can't hold this. So the evolution of photography right around 1836 grew with the growth of Houston. So I like the parallel of the old photographs in our family archive to my photographs going from film to digital, because now we've upgraded the technology. We've upgraded the technology to scan digitally these images.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, everybody, and most people don't realize it, but most acetate film, celluloid acetate film, is organic. So it's dissolving. It's going away. I wrote an article called History Going Blind, and we're losing all of our imagery. the photographs, the actual printed photographs, will fade over the decades, but the film, the originals, will dissolve. And the only person who's properly addressing this is Bill Gates. Of course, he's got all the money. So,
nice of him.
but he's scanning millions in a mine. I think it's an abandoned salt mine. 800 feet.
Oh wow!
Because they don't have to worry about an electromagnetic pulse device frying every hard drive if there is an unfortunate event, and it's protected down beneath. And negatives have to be stored at -1 degrees, sub-freezing, to stop the decomp or the deterioration process.
Otherwise, there's a slow deterioration.
There's a slow deterioration. His crew scans them in like 40, 45 degrees in parkas. So he's bought up massive archives, and everybody thought he was hoarding at first. And what he was doing is protecting our visual history. And, it's like the Romans over and was in Alexandria, and they burned in the library and all that knowledge that it contained. And I'm sure somebody in the city goes, well, something's smelling, something's burning somewhere, and it's in the direction of that library, but there's all these Romans about, and there's a battle going on, and we're not going to go preserve it. So, a lot of that history was lost.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's important in order for people to reflect on the past, to see a visual record of the past. So that's basically been my mission, is to preserve as much of Houston's visual history as humanly and financially possible. And we've got a pretty good start on that.
You've got a pretty good head start, right? I mean, you've got, didn't you say there's 20 years from 1920 to 1940 that you've got solidly documented, and then I guess expand on kind of what else is in your archive?
Well, I've been growing it to the 50s and 60s. There's an awful lot in the 70s and 80s out there because the population just bloomed. Newspapers and grew. Staff photographers were doing an awful lot of work. So, and there were several photographers that were flying grids over the city and capturing.
Oh wow!
The city block by block, basically. So I've kind of cut it at the 60s. I picked up with my own personal photography in the 70s.
Up to the 60s, you're talking about your father?
Yeah,
and
my
others.
father. But here's another point. My father would come from being on the road doing his petroleum landman lease work. He'd come downtown, type up his leases, then he would grab his camera. And then he would hit the streets, or he would drive east down Canal Street. So, they just did a new public mural in the 70s. He photographed all of that. And after he died, I went and I looked through his archive, and I'm going, oh my goodness, these are fantastic. And I never knew this mural existed. And I drove out there to Canal Street, and it was still there, but it was fainted so light you couldn't see it.
Oh wow!
And I was able to track down the son of the man who painted that mural. And he goes, Dad took some black and whites of it, but we didn't have any color reference. So I said, well, I have color reference. So I sent them to him. I said, share these with your father. So it was he continued to shoot in Houston up until, I would say, the 80s, mid-80s, until his health started preventing him from getting out in the field. And that is when I really started kicking in. So what I've been doing is acquiring other archives, other photographers' imagery, or buying them. I used to buy a lot of them on eBay. I have so much now, and probably in my lifetime, I couldn't index them. They're just too many.
It sounds like you got a lot to, yeah.
But it's still fun, and when there's a reason or a purpose, or a historian will contact me and say, hey, do you have anything of this block or in this section of Houston? What do you have of black imagery? What do you have of Hispanic imagery? And the ethnic photography in Houston, for the most part, lies cloistered in that community. So it's really hard to find out what's going on, the history of Black Houston, Hispanic Houston, Italian Houston, unless you know somebody in that community who can open a door or provide a link to, oh, this was an old photographer, and here's his son still has his archive. Go talk to him. And then you can start filling in the blanks or find another piece of that history puzzle. And I like to compare it to being a puzzle.
Yeah. So how many puzzle pieces do you have to go through in order to find a gem?
I Actually, from what I contain now, not too many. I just went through the last warehouse that contains some of my father's work, and I found six usable images in there of things. Some of them were Sam Houston Park when he was shooting down there, and I'm thinking this is really nice. And then I found some demo photographs of the old Houston City Auditorium, and they tore it down to make way for Jones Hall.
Okay.
And previously I had found some images of Jones Hall after it was brand new and open that my father had photographed, and now I have photographs of them tearing down the prior structure to build that. So that completes a big chunk of that puzzle of downtown. So in the outskirts and surrounding, there just wasn't much. I mean, there was a lot of subdivisions going on because Houston was becoming mobile with cars, and we had the Ford assembly plant here off of Harrisburg. So they were cranking them out, and people were getting mobile. But mainly they were going to build a country club like River Oaks. That's out in the boondocks, and they weren't selling any lots or anything until they put a country club in and a golf course. Then they had Walter Hagen, the golf pro, come down, and so they could start promoting it. And then after the Depression, 29, 30, things started to pick up a little bit as far as sales.
Sure.
So I probably would just concentrate with downtown, unless I had somebody come up and say, "What do you have from Memorial City?" Mm-hmm. I said, well, I've got some great shots of Memorial City because our family moved out to Memorial in '64, and it wasn't built yet. So I was, as a young man, I roamed the whole area, and then I started taking pictures when my father gave me my first camera in the mid-'70s. So
your father sounds like quite a man. Is there a quintessential story that you can share that kind of really encapsulates him and his personality?
My father was, if you look under a dictionary of altruism, that was my father. He would do for others and sacrifice for himself. However, he would not sacrifice for his family, but he would sacrifice for himself. And my favorite story of my father was there was two young boys from Venezuela. One of them was injured. He was riding on the back of a crane and fell off and was almost cut in half. So they patched him up down there, he, his brother, and his mother. And he was, I want to say, 14. His brother was 16. And they flew him to Houston. And a physician, a friend of my father, said, Story, I want you to check on these boys for me, knowing my father. And he said they're in some medical apartments. They comped them. But he says, I don't know when they've eaten last. And so my father went there, and they had no food. They couldn't speak any English. So Dad went and bought them food, bought them clothes, and then he started really putting the hard press on physicians to get this young man made right again. Wow. And his brother learned English. His brother got a job. His brother got a truck. The young man learned English, went to school, and they both ended up getting married. The young man, who was injured so severely, was made whole, has a family, and they became productive members of Houston. And nobody would know about that because Father wouldn't tell anybody about that. And before he died, the last thing he did before he died is he worked hard, to get the Korean War Memorial placed for everybody who served in the Korean War from Texas on the state capitol grounds. And it took him and a man named Jim Duncan better part of 5 years to raise the money and get this done. And it was dedicated, and George Bush was governor. And one of my proudest photographs is him shaking the governor's hand, congratulating him on the fruition of this project. And my father, as I mentioned, was a photographer in Korea. And there was a air base outside of Daegu, and he shot photographs of the natives. He photographed Texas City when it blew up, and he had enough when he was a teenager. So he had enough carnage and death as a young man. So when he was over in Korea, he took standard base photographs of aircrafts coming and going, but he would go and shoot the locals. Well, he found out that the president of Samsung Computers was from Daegu. And he sent him a booklet of all these photographs, and it almost brought the man to tears. And he decided, well, I'm going to help you finish this. So, the contributions came, and the monument was made. So, I mean, from the human side of an individual and a family to the group side of here is people, and they like to call it the forgotten war. You know, it was a war. And so those people needed to be recognized, and my father realized that. So that was his last, what I would call swan song, and he worked very diligently in order to achieve that goal.
Wow. Yeah, very amazing.
He was an amazing man. I aside from finding, sourcing out, saving this collection, it was interesting because they were incinerating them for the silver content of the negatives, and Isa, Texas did a story on them. And then 10 years later, they came back and they interviewed me for kind of a retrospective or a follow-up. And then during Hurricane Harvey, I had moved all of my negatives of this archive from my business because I was afraid the air conditioners would get ripped off and the water would train down the ductwork and all that would be lost.
Oh, for sure.
So I moved them to my house, which had never flooded in the 20 years I'd lived there. And then all of a sudden, they open up both the floodgates, and I've got 3 feet of water surrounding me. And I started moving them, and my wife's freaking out, and I'm saying, you don't understand, we're going to have water in our house. We're going to lose everything because the gates are open. So I moved all the negatives up in my attic because I knew, pretty sure the water wouldn't get that high.
Yeah, hopefully,
it got 4 feet in my house, but it didn't get up that high.
That's good.
But I had them all up there, but I also had my hard drives. And I had all my digital work and all this effort. Now, they were bagged up, but still, 2 days later, we had to leave. I didn't have access for another 2 days, and a friend of mine brought his bass boat in, and took him 3 hours to get to me, but it took us 6 boat loads, and we moved every single one of those negatives, hard drives, to dry land. It took me 3 months through 2 dehumidifiers to get everything dried out, but we were able to save it. So my father saved it from the fire. I saved it from the flood. And
it's only fitting.
I told a friend of mine, Brendan Keefe, who was a reporter here with Channel 2, and he went up to Atlanta, but he came down and did another story. And I said, Brendan, there's something biblical about this. I said, this was meant to happen. These images were meant to be preserved, and they were meant to share with the community. And my biggest joy so far is doing an exhibit after Harvey at the George R. Brown Convention Center. And that ran for a little over a year. And I spoke with their facilities manager, and she estimated that over 500,000 people saw those images. And we cherry-picked 30 images of a cross-section of Houston life. So we had Hispanics, blacks, whites, small business, big business. We tried to get a nice cross-section because I realized that other people like me, and I lost a lot of my personal photographs, that they lost, and my wife lost all of her family photographs. They lost photographs too. So there needed to be at least one place they could go and look at a selection of the history of their particular community. And that I was really proud about that. So still looking for other venues to exhibit. I've shut down my business after 36 years. We closed our showroom.
Oh, wow.
Well, you can't fight COVID, and there's too many economic factors in there. So I'll go online, and now I'm taking the show on the road.
Nice.
So lecturing more, and I eventually plan to do a Houston history blog, where we will dissect an image, a photograph. And because there's such high resolution, the negatives are 8 by 10 inches. There's so much imagery that they contain.
The actual negative
The
is?
negative's 8 by 10 inches.
How big?
So,
how big is the camera?
the camera's huge. I mean, it's what they call an old-timey view camera, and so it is much.
It's like an iPad.
It's actually If it takes an 8 by 10 negative, you know that the holder 8 by 10 negative is a little bit larger. So figure 11 by 14 back on it and a bellows, and then you'd have to put a head under a dark hood like you see in the old movies.
Oh, yeah, I love
and
that.
these photographers in this archive were just beyond talented. So I had an individual the other day said, well, we're looking for the Black Masonic Hall here in Houston, and it was the Ancient Order, the Odd Fellows chapter, and there's no picture of the building. And I looked through my archive, and I found that there indeed was a photograph of it because the awning in front had collapsed. So it shows the fire department there pushing people back. There's a crowd around the building, but it shows the building. Now it's a tragic scene, but I started clicking up on the imagery, and then I could see IO, which stands for the International Order of Oddfellows, which was a fraternal group back then.
Man.
So that was proof positive this was the building this particular historian was looking for. So, and of course you could look down and read the street address signs on the poles and learn that too. If I want to find a year or date, then I can generally click up on the license plate and pull that information
Power of a big
up.
negative, yeah.
Power of a big negative, power of
everything's big in
professional
Texas,
good.
huh?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you get a 300-400 meg file too. So if people wanted it for their office wall size, I can produce it.
You're the one. Well, we've kind of been talking a lot about some of these photographs and histories. I understand you've kind of brought a few that maybe we can kind of share.
One I want to talk about is the Iceman. And the Iceman, this particular Iceman worked for a home ice company. And my father would remember the Iceman delivering ice because they actually had ice boxes. And I still call it an ice box even after a refrigerator, became vogue. But, they would give the kids a chip of ice as a treat as they were delivering it. But it shows this man, and he's sitting there holding a 25-pound block of ice, and he's got this attitude look on his face. And he's sucking on a steel pipe with a roll of matches and a straw hat. So that's probably one of my most published images, copy-lifted images, shared images, whatever you want to call it. But it is iconic to the Sloan collection, our archive. One of my other favorite images is of the Harris County Courthouse, the whole building, because it has been preserved. And if you go inside it today, it is beautiful. It is gorgeous. It's a good example of what $85 million can do.
That's nice.
And the court is still being held there. So I believe it's federal courts that are operating in there. But it is, I know the image is 28. It's lined full of 1928 Fords all in front of it. So, and it's a beautiful architectural image. One of my other favorites is that shows the Gulf Building, which is now Chase Bank. And I believe they have a super duper food court down in one of the annexes of that building. But it's right there on the middle of Main Street, or not in the middle, but on Main Street, what I would call between north and south in that part of the middle. But it shows the Gulf Building in the center. It shows the Esperson Building off to the right. To the left, it shows the Crest Building, which is the St. Germain Lofts now. So when people say, well, we don't save anything, I can point towards that photograph and I say ABC. And, the Chamber of Commerce Building, which is right in front of the Gulf Building, that's still there too. And if you look behind it, there's the old Carter Building, which was the Second National Bank Building. That's there too. So it is a wonderful, wonderful image of Houston during the end of that growth cycle, because it's 1929. But one of my all-time favorite images is taken from the Gulf Building looking west. So far in the background, you can see a big dirt mound, which is where the Bio City cistern is now. That underground water, it was a water storage tank.
Ooh. Yes, I have been there. I watched it. Yeah, that's an amazing.
And in the foreground, you can see Sam Houston Hall, which is where the Sam Houston Coliseum used to be, which is where Jones Hall sits now.
Did you ever go to the wrestling?
I went to the wrestling all the time.
Paul Bosch,
Bosch. My father would go downtown. We would get tickets always in the first 8 to 10 rows.
Oh, wow.
So,
you were really into it. I always, when we'd watch it on TV, they would, you could see and hear the interviews, but whenever you went there, you couldn't hear the interviews. You could see Mattress Mac. He was early on.
Oh, we used to love going there. We had friends that would go. We'd go to Spaghetti Warehouse.
Oh, yeah, for
stuff
sure.
ourselves full and then go there and watch those wrestling matches. And I saw Wahoo McDaniels throw Johnny Valentine into. There was they had the steel girders, but they didn't have any ropes. And he threw him straight into that pole. I watched his head split wide open, blood come out. And my father was always telling me they're fake. And I'm grabbing him and I'm going, you see, it's real. And he's just going, oh. And they carried him out on a stretcher, so it knocked him out.
It must have been, yeah.
But it was, it was a blast. But when you think, well, from Jones Hall to Sam Houston Coliseum to Sam Houston Hall, which was built in 60 days to house a Democratic convention.
Oh, wow.
Houstonian Jesse Jones ponied up, wrote him a check, Democratic Party a check for $250,000 back then and said, Houston's a major metropolis. We're going to showcase the city. I want it in Houston, and I'm going to pay for it to be in Houston. So in essence, that's what he did.
Wow.
City Hall wasn't built yet. So in this photograph, there's a carnival where City Hall sits, which is ironic as hell. And I was at a meeting, it was an exhibit, and Mayor Bill White was there. And I looked at him, and he's looking at it, and I said, see that carnival there, Mayor? And he says, yes. And I said, that's where your office is today, off of Bagby. That's where City Hall's built. And he looked at me, and I said, so the circus has moved indoors instead of being held outdoors. And he gave me this stern look, and then a grin came on his face, and he goes, to some degree, yes. So
he acknowledged it. That's nice.
It shows the Julian Eisen Library. So it shows and it also shows Sam Houston Park, which is Houston's first city park. So that's one of those images, those negatives that contains an awful lot of information that you can extract. I guess we figured out, me and another historian, Jim Fisher, figured out it was 1932 by zooming up on a movie poster on a billboard that was in front of a Greek Orthodox church that has all been long gone torn down. But we found the actor's name, went and researched that a little bit further, and we found out that movie came out in 1932. And they showed first-run movies back then. It wasn't necessarily like they're going to show, a 2 or 3 year old movie. So we were pretty confident on the date. Now, this was shot from far back from the Gulf Building looking west. So Buffalo Drive is what you can see, and they reconfigured that into Allen Parkway. So and Fourth Ward and all of that has been changed. And if you look way far in the background, you can see the Sears and Roebuck building off of Buffalo Drive, and I believe it was Lincoln, that flooded during that 35 storm. So before they moved it to here, which is now this. So, but yeah, those are images that over the years I've come to draw on for reference, to talk about in lectures for the reasons mentioned, because they show a visual example of it's a visual time capsule. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I view this. It's all, besides pieces of a puzzle, it's a visual time capsule. And they say one picture tells 1,000 words or whatever. It's true. So, and you can grab somebody's attention. I can be one of the best speakers on this planet, but I will fall short if I don't show an image that corresponds to what I'm talking about. And cross the T, dot the I's, and put the exclamation point behind history. Yep. Because now you're looking at it face to face.
That's wonderful. I could totally see you doing a presentation down here at the Ion at those steps right there. And I hope that I'm going to put that out there in the ethos that somehow.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah.
I mean, the bigger the audience,
I can see you really cranking up.
I started out terrified. I have night sweats worrying about it. And, I've been interviewed live so many times that, and my father, told me a long time ago, he says, always remember this, a little more than they do. And he says, you've studied it, you're part of it. And so stop stressing about it and then start trying to articulate what you know in the most direct way that you can find so people will appreciate it and then want to preserve it. So, and that's another reason I have a tendency to be drawn to showing the positive things, the positive aspects. I've got a photograph of the old Metropolitan Theater. And, back they had community chests, which is the United Way. It morphed into it. And during the war, it became the war chest from the community chest. And they were raising, $514,000. Now, this is back in the late 20s, early 30s. That is a Herculean amount of money. But they raised it. And that money was spread out through the whole community. And it's a flatbed truck with the Metropolitan Theater house band on the back. And you look in the windows and you can see the girlfriends in the windows looking at the band members.
Oh, wow.
You look in the doorway and there's a mime in the doorway. There's a man that looks like he's the bouncer in the back. There's a man that looks like he's the one who checks everybody in, balding hair, wire rimmed glasses. But the photograph tells a story, but it tells a story of community involvement. And how they raised that money was through the Chamber of Commerce. The captains of industry put the squeeze on all their employees, saying, "You work for me, you've got to donate here."
Let's do this.
They raised the money, so it was wonderful. The last example I'll talk about would be the Cynthia Gray Milk Fund Group. And this was a group of women, and I found them. They were photographed on the mezzanine of the Rice Hotel. You can see the clock in the background, so we know, and I know it was in August, so it was hot. These women are all dressed in their finery. I believe it was 31, 32. And this whole group of maybe 50 women, there's one little boy in there, and he looks like he's in hell. And, why am I here? And I know some grandmother hauled him there. But the Cynthia Gray Milk Fund Group was funded and founded by Mrs. Randolph Hearst, because she started the first milk funds. And it was in Houston because they had a Hearst publication in Houston. So they had a Cynthia Gray in Houston. They had one up in New York. So it was like a Dear Abby columnist. Yeah. The doctor who founded this group, Elva Wright, believed that milk stemmed the tide of tuberculosis. So here's a woman doctor, very progressive during that period of time. She lobbied Congress, Texas State Congress, to get funds for milk. 100% of their money went for the charity. Volunteers from various banks managed all the funds. It was around for about a decade, and then it just disappeared. But it's another wonderful example of altruism at the grassroots level. It also showcases the Rice Hotel. And you could go there today and have your photograph made in the exact same place. And aside from the skyscrapers behind it, there's nothing has changed, which is a wonderful, wonderful aspect and a wonderful thing to realize and to think about, that there's some places you can go in this city that have not changed.
I think that's a great place to end it.
All right.
So I know you're working on kind of getting a website going. Where can people kind of go now? I know you have an Instagram. Definitely want to share.
I have Instagram. My Instagram is mainly my own personal photography. I've got a Facebook, Sloan Gallery on Facebook, which showcases a good part. And I contribute to other Facebook groups, but Sloan Gallery is a good place to start. I have sloangallery.com. And it's an antiquated front page authored website, but you can still see an incredible amount of visual history of Houston. So, and I'm working on a Houston history blog. So eventually we'll get there.
All right. Well, when you get that back up and running, we'd love to have you back. And,
well, I appreciate you having me on.
This
This has been a lot of fun.
So thank you so much. I'm so glad to have met you. And thanks for giving us a little bit of a look back into the great 100 years that Houston is, and look forward to the next Sunday.
You're very welcome.
So we'll definitely be putting all of those details down in the description, so be sure to look in there and get started at sloangallery.com. And we want to give a big thanks to Story. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Watch you go, and every time you leave, it's X and O's, X and O's. The vibe is so official, there ain't nothing coming close. And whenever we link, it's X and O's, X and O's, X and O's, X and O's. X and O's, X and O's, X and O's, X and O's. X and O's, X and O's.